The New York Mets built the most expensive team in Major League history to chase a World Series championship. But instead of winning it all, they started to blow it up before you could even say lol Mets. Steve Cohen became a minority owner of the Mets in 2012. Then he took over ownership of the team when he bought them in October 2020 for an estimated $2.4 billion. Cohen had one goal in mind: win a World Series no matter what, and he proved his willingness to do whatever it takes to win by ramping up the payroll in 2021, 2022, and again in 2023. And as soon as he took over, the Mets got busy right away. During the 2021 offseason, they traded Andres Gimenez, Ahmed Rosario, and two other prospects to Cleveland for shortstop Francisco Lindor and starting pitcher Carlos Carrasco, and they extended Lindor on a 10-year, $341 million contract. Then during the season, they traded top prospect Pete Crow Armstrong to the Cubs for two-time All-Star and king of free swingin' Javi Baez. The Mets finished 2021 77-85 and missed the playoffs. Baez would walk that offseason, but the Mets were just getting started. They signed three-time Cy Young winner Max Scherzer for 3 years, $130 million, with the third year being a player option, and outfielder Starling Marte, who'd made one All-Star team to this point, for 4 years, $78 million. Then they traded for starting pitcher Chris Bassett from the Oakland A's, coming off of his first All-Star season. In 2022, the Mets jumped up to a 101-61 record. They finished second in the NL East, but ended up losing in the wildcard series 2-1 to the Padres. They knew they were close, so now it was time to go all in. Even more all in. But New York had a lot of work to do going into the 2023 offseason. Center fielder Brandon Nimmo, closer Edwin Diaz, and starters Jacob deGrom, Chris Bassett, and Taijuan Walker were part of the 16 players the Mets had hitting free agency. They had to make a big splash, and they did my boy Ham Porter proud. First, they brought back some of their own guys by giving Nimmo an 8-year, $162 million deal, and the two-time All-Star Diaz got the biggest deal ever for a reliever at 5 years, $102 million. Then on top of these deals, they also went out and added Justin Verlander to a 3-year, $121.67 million deal coming off of his third Cy Young award, with the third year being a vesting option, the top Japanese pitcher on the market, Kodai Senga, to a 5-year, $75 million deal, and the one-time All-Star starting pitcher Jose Quintana for 2 years, $26 million. New York spent over $500 million during the offseason, and along with a handful of other smaller deals and extensions since Steve Cohen took over, the Mets were set to go into 2023 with a record-breaking payroll estimated at around $353.5 million according to USA Today. So it was obvious that anything less than winning the World Series would be a failure of a season. But before the season even started, the Mets were already cursed. During the World Baseball Classic, Edwin Diaz tore the patellar tendon in his right knee, celebrating a win for Puerto Rico. He was done for the year. Jose Quintana and Justin Verlander also both hit the IL before the start of the season. Verlander didn't come back until May 5th, and Quintana was out until mid-July. Carlos Carrasco, Pete Alonso, and Starling Marte also each missed some time, and going into July 28th, the Mets sat at 48-54, 7 games back of the final wildcard spot, with the 5th worst record in the National League. New York had dealt with injuries, players underperforming, and at this point, despite being the most expensive team ever assembled, they gave up on 2023 and decided to sell at the deadline.
You f***ing failure!
Hold on a second.
They traded reliever David Robertson to the Marlins, Max Scherzer went to the Rangers, outfielder Mark Canha to the Brewers, reliever Dominic Leone to the Angels, outfielder Tommy Pham to the Diamondbacks, and Justin Verlander went back to the Astros. As part of these trades, Scherzer would opt into his player option, and the Mets would pay all but $22.5 million of his remaining contract. and they would pay $35 million of Verlander's contract in 2023 and 2024, and half of his $35 million vesting option for 2025 if that kicks in. Now, in these deals, the Mets got the Rangers' number 3 prospect Luis Angel Acuna and the Astros' number 1 prospect Drew Gilbert, and both of these guys would help add on to a farm system that was already ranked 11th by MLB.com coming into the season. So yeah, they got rid of some guys that weren't going to help them out much past this year, and they got a couple highly rated prospects that could help out going forwards. But this was a team that was built to win now, and it only took half of a season before they started focusing on the future. After he was traded to the Rangers, Scherzer came out and said that he had talked with Mets GM Billy Epler about the team's vision for the future, and Epler told him that they were aiming for, quote, 2025 at the earliest, more like 26. So this wasn't just let's get rid of expiring contracts and try again next year. The front office was already looking 2 to 3 years ahead. How in the world did we get here with this team after half a season? Before we get to that, I gotta shout out the sponsor of today's video, OddsJam. OddsJam is the top choice for data-driven sports betting, tracking over 260 sportsbooks in real time. With OddsJam, you'll become a profitable sports bettor using strategies similar to those employed by successful investors and traders. How does it work? Thanks to the OddsJam arbitration tool, which identifies discrepancies in sports betting lines across the market. This tool finds arbitrage betting opportunities, guaranteeing risk-free profits by spotting these differences. You can even bet on both sides of the market and still make a profit, but that's not all. OddsJam also offers a positive EV calculator to help you optimize your bet sizes and a bet tracker to monitor your profits across all your sportsbook accounts. By using OddsJam, you'll bet smarter and more responsibly, leading to long-term profitability. Plus, they're so confident in their product that they offer a 7-day free trial. Ready to try it out? Use code BASEBALL for a 35% discount on your first month, and thanks again to OddsJam for sponsoring this video. Well, first, let's take a look at the lineup. And this all starts with those key guys that you're relying on to carry the offense. Through July 27th, Lindor was off to a bit of a slow start with his average and strikeout percentage worse than we were used to seeing from him, but he was still walking and hitting homers. Pete Alonso's average was down too, with terrible luck on balls in play, but he had plenty of homers already. Good luck catching it if I just hit it over the fence. Nimmo was hitting solid across the board, just not quite as good as he'd been the last 3 years, but Marte, that man was on the struggle bus, missing some time like I said, and he was a far cry even from what he was doing the year before when he made his second All-Star team. Lindor and Alonso hadn't been as consistent as you'd hope to this point. Nimmo was underperforming just a bit after getting his big contract, and Marte was struggling a lot. And then as far as your role players, you had Tommy Pham with an OPS over 800 in 76 games. Mark Canha and Daniel Vogelbach were both about league average hitters in terms of WRC+, but Jeff McNeil, Eduardo Escobar, Luis Guillorme, Omar Narvaez, there was no one else in this lineup that had at least a 700 OPS or a 90 WRC+. So a lot of your vets weren't getting it done. But how about your young guys and the top prospects that you brought up? Well, their top prospect, Francisco Alvarez, had been hitting for pretty good power at the catcher position. But at third, their number 2 prospect, Brett Beatty, he'd been getting absolutely worked by Major League pitching, and you could say the same for Mark Vientos in his limited time this season. So a lot of the veteran bats in this lineup were struggling, the young guys were struggling, and overall you had a lineup that wasn't playing as advertised, struggling to hit, get on base, and just score runs. And sadly, it's not like the pitching was much better. Well, the top of the rotation had mostly been pretty good. Despite missing a couple starts, Verlander had still done a great job of keeping runs off the board. He just wasn't looking quite as dominant anymore with his strikeouts way down. Scherzer was having a rough go of things, getting lit up for a ton of home runs already, and Senga had arguably been their best pitcher to this point, even though he was walking a lot of guys. You definitely weren't getting your money's worth out of Scherzer this year, Verlander had been good, just not quite $40 million a year kind of good, and Senga had been nearly everything you could have hoped for to this point. But outside of these three, the rotation was in shambles. Carlos Carrasco, Tyler McGill, and David Peterson were the other three starters that had double-digit starts to this point. Not a single one of them had an ERA under 5. And overall, the rotation wasn't getting through very many innings, and even though they were about average in ERA, they were giving up a lot of base runners, and they just weren't pitching as well as their ERA would have suggested. So New York wasn't getting a lot out of their starters outside of their top two, and it was basically the same thing with the bullpen. David Robertson had done a fantastic job taking over as the closer with Edwin Diaz out. You had Brooks Raley also doing a great job of limiting runs despite giving up some walks, and Adam Ottavino was also keeping runs to a minimum without being real dominant. But you know where I'm going with this. Outside of these three, you had 5 other relievers that had gone at least 20 innings so far. None of them had an ERA under 4, and only 2 had an ERA under 5. So good luck getting to the back end of your bullpen if the rest of the guys just blow it before you can even bring them in. By the time they chose to punt on the 2023 season, the Mets weren't really hitting, they weren't really pitching, their big contracts weren't paying off, and their young talent wasn't coming along. The Mets really spent all this money just to have everything go wrong. They finished the 2023 season at 75-87, 4th in the NL East. They parted ways with manager Buck Showalter, and this brings us to this year. And thank God they were planning on 2025 because 2024 hasn't gone any better. Well, first, this offseason, New York really didn't do much. They signed starting pitcher Sean Manaea to a 2-year, $28 million deal, and they gave a bunch of 1-year contracts to starting pitcher Luis Severino, DH JD Martinez, outfielder Harrison Bader, and a handful of relievers. And right now, the Mets have the 6th worst record at 24-34, a whopping 16.5 games back in the division already, and reliever Jorge Lopez was ejected from a game the other night, chucked his glove in the stands, and during his post-game interview, people thought that he called the Mets. He didn't, let me clarify that, but people thought he called them, quote, the worst fucking team in MLB, and everyone kinda just went, well, he's not wrong.
We don't have to go there. I mean, you're not wrong, but you didn't have to say it. I mean, good Lord.
So how are they so bad this year? Well, again, the Mets just aren't getting enough from their main bats. Lindor is off to a slow start again and hasn't been quite as patient as we're used to seeing him. Alonso's having another slow start too, and an OPS under 800 isn't what you're hoping for from arguably your biggest bat. Nimmo's been walking a lot, but he hasn't been getting it done nearly enough with the bat, especially after getting moved out of center, and Marte's bounced back to start this year, but you like to see him be a bit more patient so he can get some more walks and a little bit better pitches to hit. None of these guys have been bad by any means, but you're not looking for just good enough from a group that combined is making almost $95 million this year. You need the guys that you're paying to lead your team to carry your offense. Like my parents always told me, that's not good enough.
I'm beginning to think I have issues.
Now you do have a couple bright spots so far. Mark Vienos has had a terrific start, getting another chance after Brett Beatty struggled again, and JD Martinez has been hitting well as your DH. If he keeps this up, you should be able to flip him at the deadline if you want to. But then you have the same story, where your role players and the young guys that you hoped would step up haven't been giving you much. Beatty hasn't been able to find his footing at third, like I said, and he was sent back down to AAA. Jeff McNeil is hitting all of .230, and if he's not slapping singles all around the field, he's really not giving you anything else offensively. And Francisco Alvarez was off to a slow start before he needed surgery for a torn thumb ligament. But the injury part of that's not his fault. Again, this offense just isn't playing up to the level that you need them to. With how much money you've committed, this should be at minimum a top 10 offense. But your stars are still underperforming, your role players aren't filling in around them, and your top prospects are having a tough time coming into their own. And on the pitching side, again, yeah, there's some bright spots, but most of the main guys that you're betting your season on haven't come through for you. Before the season even started, the Mets lost Kodai Senga for the season due to a shoulder injury. And again, I'm not blaming him for that, but Jose Quintana has been getting smacked around for a ton of hits and homers, and Edwin Diaz was getting absolutely rocked for a ton of bombs, and he was getting moved out of the closer role before he hit the IL with a shoulder injury. Losing your number one starter is a huge hit for any team. Then you add in the fact that the highest paid reliever in the league can't hold on to the closer role. I guess it's a good thing then that you've had some of these other guys step up in their place, or this could have somehow been way worse than it already is. Sean Manaea's done a great job of keeping the ball in the ballpark. That way the base runners that he has allowed haven't come around to hurt him too much. Luis Severino's allowed a double-digit walk percentage, but he's done a great job of limiting what hitters have done with the bat against him. And Reed Garrett has stepped up to take on some of the closing duties, holding a strikeout percentage just over 35%. You'll at least be able to flip some of these guys on expiring contracts at the deadline if you want to, but then where does that put you going into next year? Who's gonna step up and take over those spots, especially in the rotation, once these guys leave? And that brings us to what the Mets' plan is. Even with an estimated $324 million payroll this year, it's looking like they're gonna have to punt on another season. They've still got a lot of things to figure out. So where does this team go from here if the goal is to still try and compete for a World Series starting in 2025 or 26? New York is locked into Francisco Lindor at $34.1 million a year through 2031, Brandon Nimmo at $20.5 million through 2030, Edwin Diaz at an AAV of $18.6 million through 2027, but he can opt out after 25 and 26, Kodai Senga at an AAV of $15 million through 2027, and Jeff McNeil for an AAV of $12.5 through 2026. So these contracts aren't going anywhere anytime soon. You're committed to either building around these guys or just eating this money until their contracts are up. But you do have Starling Marte's contract up after next year. Sean Manaea could opt out after this year, or he's off the books after next year. And New York is only committed to just under a $160 million payroll going into next year, according to Fangraphs. The Mets do have some flexibility going into free agency this offseason if they want to be big players, like it's reported that they do. And part of that'll be re-signing Pete Alonso, who will be testing free agency if you want him back. But you can't just rely on signing big free agents to build out your roster. For one thing, they have to actually want to go to your team, and even last offseason, Yoshinobu Yamamoto reportedly turned down bigger offers than the one that he signed to go join the Dodgers. But also, go ahead and ask the Angels how being super top heavy with talent worked out for them. So for one thing, you don't want to have to just keep spending more and more on the luxury tax, but also you have to build out your roster around your star players. So you've also got to get a handful of role players on smaller contracts to fill out key spots on your roster, as well as developing the young players that you already have in your organization, especially your top prospects. Francisco Alvarez, Brett Beatty, Mark Viennos. Yeah, these guys have shown glimpses of being good players. It's on you to develop these guys into solid major league players, as well as the prospects that you've either drafted or traded for. Yeah, the guys you signed a big contract should do most of the heavy lifting. That's what you're paying them to do. But you're crazy to expect them to do everything for you. In baseball, money helps you win. That's no secret. In a league without a salary cap, if you can just way outpay your competition, you definitely have a leg up on them. But spending big doesn't guarantee that you'll win. At the end of the day, you still have to spend smart. You have to get the right guys into your organization, draft and develop from within, make good trades, and build a winning roster. Not just buy star players and expect that'll mean that you're gonna win big. Yeah, there's some big names in free agency this offseason, but one big free agent class isn't gonna fix all the problems that the Mets are having. So I'm curious what you think about all this, everything that's been going wrong in New York, and how you think the Mets can get out of this hole that they've dug themselves into. leave a comment and let me know. If you enjoyed the video, then make sure you like and subscribe to see more videos from us, and you can check out more baseball content like this by clicking on the video on your screen now. Thank you so much for watching and supporting the channel. Hope you have a good one. Later.